Hi, how are you?
Is this all?
Yes, this is all.
Okay. Your total's gonna be $649.
I wanted to use my credit card today. Could you see if there's any rewards on it?
It's a credit card, so there would be no rewards on it.
I thought the points were linked to my account. Can't you check?
No, there's no way for me to check because it's a credit card.
Hi, what can I get for you?
I want a latte with whole milk, but I'm lactose intolerant.
We do offer milk alternatives like oat and almond milk.
Last time I checked, milk is something that comes from a cow, so I refuse to drink anything that doesn't come from a cow.
Alright, so today's video, we're going to be getting into the Gen Z stare. This has been a huge conversation all over social media for like the past week, and I wasn't going to make a video on this originally. I wasn't going to. I was like, man, this is just another like, silly internet discourse trend thingy. Like, what's the point of getting into it? But when I really thought about it, I feel like the discourse around the Gen Z stare is very nuanced, and honestly, depending on who you talk to, you're going to get different opinions and different perspectives. So I kind of wanted to dive into the perspectives, give my perspective as, I guess, an elder Gen Z. I was born in 1998, so I'm an elder Gen Zer, or I guess a zillennial, some people want to call me, whatever you want to call me. And I just want to give my perspective on this whole thing because it's quite fascinating how this has taken storm. It's really surprising to me because I really looked at this as like a chronically online take at first, but now let's just dive into it. So what is the Gen Z stare? So the Gen Z stare essentially is this really blank, emotionless stare that a Gen Zer will give you in response to either something dumb you said, something rude you said, or it could mean that they don't have any social skills. So like I said before, I said in the intro that it really depends on who you ask. Gen Zers will say that we do this blank emotionless stare because you said something rude or stupid. And then millennials or boomers or elder people will say that, oh, it's a lack of social skills. So we're gonna get into those perspectives. So again, it's like a wide, vacant, basically a flat affect. It's basically like that. Like you just completely are flat, vacant, and you just have like no expression. And this stare is commonly observed or talked about in customer service settings. So this has really been discussed a lot amongst like food service, like people working in fast food restaurants or retail. You have a lot of elder people that have gone online and talked about the fact that they've noticed this blank stare. Like literally they'll go to a Gen Zer and ask them, hey, how are you doing? And they just give them this stare. So that's kind of where this has really been discussed. And I think this has ballooned into more of a conversation around social skills, especially in the service workplaces, all kinds of service-oriented jobs. So the term Gen Z stare actually does come from TikTok. This came from a user named Megan Alisi last year, and she basically made this video about every time I'm in public and it's a Gen Z worker, they just stare at you. And then this basically took storm as of last week. So it's interesting, like she posted this like a year ago and it's now really getting more discourse and traction. And TikTok has ran with it. There's all kinds of memes, spoofs, all kinds of jokes and discourse about the Gen Z stare. Everyone is weighing in on their opinion. It's literally not even just on TikTok, it's literally on news outlets like CNN, Business Insider, all kinds of news outlets. Like this has become like a very common conversation now. So now we're gonna get into why some people defend the stare. Why do some people, especially like young Gen Zers, defend this stare? So one of the reasons is because of burnout. A lot of Gen Zers say that they're very burnt out, and this is due to just the way society is nowadays. The fact that the economy is in a very, very rough state right now. The fact that many Gen Zers are not really where they want to be by this time of their life. A lot of Gen Zers are feeling like they're not meeting the milestones that their parents were once reaching or their grandparents were reaching. It's much harder to just feel like an adult in today's society given the state of things. And then there's also the conversation of the pandemic and how the pandemic really disrupted a lot of things for young people. So I actually kind of have an unpopular opinion surrounding the pandemic conversation. So a lot of talking points, or I guess one of the main talking points with this conversation has been that the pandemic has really disrupted a lot of Gen Zers' social skills. And that's probably why so many Gen Zers struggle with basic interaction and struggle with, socialization. Now for me, I kind of have an unpopular opinion with this because when we look at Gen Z is from the year 1997 to 2012. That's like statistically what Gen Z, the age range or the years are defined as. You know, there's some variation, some people will say it differently, but 1997 to 2012 is like the most widely accepted age range. So that means when the pandemic happened, the eldest of Gen Zers were turning 23 at the time, and the youngest Gen Zer was probably 7 turning 8. So I feel like a lot of times with this Gen Z stare conversation, I feel like it's really geared towards like mid Gen Z and possibly young Gen Z. And, you know, for me, when I think about the pandemic, obviously the pandemic affected a lot of things, right? The pandemic really changed the game for forever, you know what I mean? Like the pandemic really changed a lot of things, really disrupted a lot of things. I remember with the pandemic, I was 21 at the time of the pandemic. I was a senior in college, and you know, that was right before I was about to enter the workforce. Like it happened right before I graduated. And so that definitely did throw things off for a little bit. And I think it threw things off for a lot of people. So I'm definitely not discounting that at all. But when I really think about the age of like, you know, a Gen Zer, let's say like a mid Gen Zer. So let's say from like, you know, 2003 to like 2007. You were a teenager, you know, like you were a teenager or maybe you were a preteen. And I'm not really talking about, you know, young Gen Z, like younger ones. I'm really talking about like the mid Gen Z, which I think people who are mid Gen Z, those are the ones that we're really seeing in service roles right now, at least that I've seen. And I really feel like by that age, I feel like you know better. I feel like you know how to at least do basic conversation. That's an unpopular opinion, I guess, but I feel like by that age, like you should know basic, you know, just like, hey, how are you? I'm good, how are you? Like you should know basic conversational things. I'm not saying you have to have, you should be like Barack Obama being able to have a whole speech with somebody, but I feel like by that age, I feel like you should know better. Like even if you were a preteen, like, don't you know, like basically that's just how I see it. I'm not trying to like rag on anyone, you know, that's like younger than me, but I just feel like when I was that age, I knew basic conversation, even though I was very shy. I just feel like it's a bit weird. Like, I feel like the idea of like, oh, we don't know how to socialize at all. I could see maybe for like young Gen Z, people who were 6, 7, 8 years old at the time of the pandemic, I think that's one thing. But for people who are teens, granted, yes, it happened at very pivotal time, very formative years. You maybe lost out on prom. You lost out on like being able to do certain things independently at an earlier age. I totally acknowledge that. But I don't know. I just don't understand not being able to do like just very basic small talk and using the pandemic as a reason for that. I don't feel like that's the pandemic's fault, but hey, unpopular opinion, what do I know? There's also the topic of overstimulation. So a lot of Gen Zers grew up with screens in front of their face. They literally grew up with smartphones, with iPads from the moment they were like 1, 2, 3 years old, possibly when they were born. You know what I mean? So a lot of Gen Zers have grown up with smartphones, grown up with social media. They have only known stimulation and overstimulation and the constant dopamine hit. You know, I'll say for myself, so smartphones and social media started to become a thing when I was a teenager. So I feel like it's kind of weird. I feel like I have the best of both worlds. I feel like I grew up with like a very millennial sort of childhood, but then also had like a more, I guess, social media ridden teenhood and young adulthood. And I think especially like, I think for people who are in Gen Z, let's say if you had millennial siblings, then that will also kind of like dictate how you grew up. And even maybe like, even like social class, like how financially well off your family was. Like if you weren't very financially secure as a kid, you might've grown up with older stuff, you know, like older things that other people didn't have. So I don't know, it just makes me think about in terms of like the social media exposure, there's just a lot of overstimulation. And when you're constantly inundated with dopamine and constantly comparing yourself to people online, constantly getting all this like social interaction online, when you go out in person, you don't really know how to interact as much because you don't practice it as much. So I think in a lot of ways, the blank stare in that respect is kind of seen as like avoiding doing something wrong or trying to avoid being awkward because you don't really know what to say and you don't want to say anything disrespectful. You don't want to say anything rude. Again, you spend so many of your formative years online and on, you know, Zoom classes and things like that, that you might not have that ability to really interact as normally as you should. And again, like I said, I still find it a bit odd considering the fact that a lot of, let's say, mid-Gen Zers were teenagers at the time of the pandemic. So I feel like by that point, you should have like a baseline. But I also understand that, especially like the way technology advanced so quickly and the fact that we were shut in for so long, that could really accelerate things. There's also the explanation that Gen Z is just tired. They're not trying to be hostile. There's no intention for hostility. You're just genuinely tired. Again, working retail can be a very tiring, mentally taxing experience. It doesn't mean that you're being rude. It just means you might not have the mental capacity or energy. There's also the explanation that the Gen Z stare only comes out when warranted. So again, if you are disrespectful to an employee, if you say something that literally makes no sense, then they feel the need to give this stare. But to be honest, I feel like this is just the customer service stare. Like, I feel like this is just a stare that retail workers for decades have been giving. Like, even for me, when I go out sometimes and I'm being serviced by someone who's older, they'll sometimes give you a stare or be a little deadpan or be a bit bitter looking. Like, I feel like that's just something that everyone does, and it's just been coined the Gen Z stare because it's being seen as happening more often with younger people. So now it's easy to just peg Gen Z as having this stare, when I feel like millennials had the pause, like millennials had the millennial pause. I think eye rolling was really popular with Gen X. I feel like that got popularized with Gen X. So it's like, you know, I feel like every generation has their thing, but especially within retail and customer service and public facing jobs, I think everyone has had like their version of the stare. So another reason is also due to the fact that Gen Z is just not used to small talk. They're just not used to small talk and having to do the, hey, how are you? How's the weather thing? Like, that's just not something that they're as used to and as exposed to. And I think this also goes into the idea of authenticity over etiquette. So I think especially over the past several years, a lot of people are craving authenticity. I think people, no matter how old you are craving authenticity, tired of fakeness. But I think the younger generation is specifically being more loud and bold about the idea of wanting more genuine, more real, refreshing interactions and people online. And I think Gen Z is just in a position where they don't want to fake it. They don't want to fake who they are and fake being nice and fake pleasantries just so that way they can be palatable. I think they want to just be who they are. I think they also see it as like, I'm in this low paying job that stresses me out, so why do I need to do extra? You know, however, I will say, and the other side of this conversation is the fact that, well, you're in a customer service job and that's part of the job. Like, you can't just say you don't want to be nice or you don't want to be whatever. You're literally in a public facing job where you have to use those interpersonal skills, you know? And I agree, to be honest, I agree that interpersonal skills are very important. Like, it's not just going to be relevant in a job such as being a food worker or being in retail, but also in the real world. When you get into your actual career, you might have to interact with people. Being interpersonally smart or having interpersonal intelligence really goes a long way. I mean, I'm not trying to throw shade, but like, you'll see some people where they may not be the best at their job, but because they're like really interpersonal and they're just really good at communicating, they're able to kind of skate by. Like, you know, like, it's so amazing. And that's how it's been for decades. Like, people who are not the most competent still rise through the ranks because they're so, like, they have so much charisma, they're so charming, they're so good at interacting with people, or they're a likable person. You know what I mean? Being likable and being able to communicate really has its advantages, okay? I'm just, just from what I've seen personally in the workplace, it really does help sometimes. So in a way, I kind of see it as like, I completely understand that you're in a role that stresses you out. You don't get paid a lot. I completely get that. And I think it's, you know, I don't think you need to be chipper all the time. I think that's really unrealistic to expect people to constantly be chipper 24/7 all the time. But I also feel like it really is a skill that you can't just abdicate. You can't just decide that you don't want to have that skill because it will really support you in life. Man, I feel like I sound like a freaking auntie or something. I'm not trying to lecture, but it's just what I've personally seen. So in a way, it kind of doesn't make sense to me in that respect. All right, so now we're gonna go to the flip side, why some criticize the stare, okay? Why some people criticize the stare. So many people feel like it's just bad manners. So one person on Reddit said, blankly staring at someone who says thank you with a smile is rude no matter what age you are, it's also creepy. And again, like I said before, you know, another reason is the lack of soft skills. So like Business Insider actually said that standing silently with a vacant look when a customer greets you could be seen as an evidence of underdeveloped communication abilities or workplace awkwardness. In other words, critics frame it as a failure of training or socialization, perhaps because these kids were raised on screens and never learned how to properly interact face to face. Again, and older generations emphasize things like smiling, making eye contact, saying having a nice day as essential parts of the job. And when a Gen Z worker doesn't engage in that performative friendliness, it's often seen as disengagement or laziness. Even a TikToker who's a millennial said, mind you, I used to work at Disney, but I still don't think it's unreasonable to expect a hey or a smile.
We're finally talking about the Gen Z stare. I have an example that happened in real time. If your For You page looks different than mine, we're talking about the Gen Z stare, where people in the service industry of a certain age don't even say hello to you. They stare at you. Why did I go in to pick up my order at Chipotle and the girl turns her head and just stares at me? I go, hi, I'm picking up for Ashley. And it always just feels like you're inconveniencing them. That's the tone they set when they don't say hello. And I don't care if this makes me a Karen. I'm sick of the argument of they don't get paid enough to be nice. Yeah, but every single job description in the world, especially customer facing, the very first descriptor is greet customers or have some sort of customer service skill. This generation is wild. And I've had it happen before at like a drive-through where you get to the window and they just look at you like this. But this girl didn't even raise her eyebrows at me to prompt me to speak, and that really threw me off. The eyebrow lift thing is like rude to me in my opinion as well, but like completely blank glazed over stare, please.
I also want to add that a lot of times I think there's a misinterpretation behind the stare. So like I said earlier, you know, for a lot of Gen Zers, they've said, hey, I'm just tired. Hey, I'm just, you know, a little overstimulated. It's not rude. But I also think there's the, including people who may be neurodivergent, people who may not understand or have as strong social cues in general. So for them, it's like genuinely like, I can't help it. Like, I'm really not trying to be rude, but an older person will see it as like, oh, they're being rude. They're giving me a dirty look. They're doing this, they're doing that. So it's kind of like, don't assume so quickly that the stare is because of rudeness or because the person felt a way about you. And I think it's important to, you know, acknowledge nuance and context as well in situations. Like sometimes some people are genuinely giving you the stank eye and they're genuinely, you know, mean mugging you. Like, you know, when someone's mean mugging you intentionally versus when it possibly could just be you know, an off day, or maybe it's just their face. You know, it's kind of hard to discern that in the moment, but I think in general, like, I feel like there's little things that can give off the, you know, the difference, I guess. I don't know. And again, like I mentioned earlier, some people just think it's creepy. People think it's creepy when you're being nice and then you just blankly stare at them or you give them a rude look. It's kind of like, what's wrong with you? Why are you being so rude or weird when I'm just saying the most basic hello? Like, this is just part of society. Like, this is just kind of like normal niceties that we have in society. And again, I think people feel that no matter how old you are, you know, or no matter what you're going through, it doesn't cost anything to be kind. It doesn't cost anything to perform or be in these pleasantries. So like I said, I will honestly say, I think I lean more towards that boat. I think it doesn't really cost anything to be nice, but I also understand this generation is facing things that other generations didn't face. But like I said, I also feel even just saying, hey, how are you? Even if it's just like a, hey, how are you? Like, it's still kind of like, but at least you tried, right? Like, at least you tried, okay? Because I'll be honest, I did that before. I've done that before when I was younger. Like, I would just be like, yeah, hey, how are you? Hey, I'm good, how are you? Like, I'll do it and it's kind of dry. You can tell I'm not really into it, but at least just for the formality of it all, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's a normal thing to do. I feel like that's something you can't really run from. I see both sides of the coin, but I kind of lean a little more towards the millennial side, you know? I still think it's crazy that this is a conversation to begin with, but yeah, anyway, let's keep going. And I do think, again, like, that's what customer service is. It's literally customer service. Like, that's the job. You know what I'm saying? Like, unless we decide to change customer service to where it's just deadpan. And, you know, it makes me even think, like, in other countries, like, different countries take customer service so seriously. Like, I think about even in Japan. Now, granted, in Japan, you know, a lot of Japanese people, I think, tend to hide how they really feel a lot of times. Like, that culture is very much dependent on making sure that you don't actually say what you really think. And so some people can see Japanese people as being fake or not being genuine because they have this sort of like natural inclination to hide how they feel. But for example, when I went to Japan last year, like, people were just so kind no matter what, even to tourists, even to like, they really value customer service. And that's a huge pillar in those countries. But then it gets into conversations of, okay, well, those countries have this thing is better in this country. Like, you know, there's more third spaces in Japan. There's more this. So it gets into that conversation, which I literally just thought of. You can tell I'm kind of just going off the cuff now with my thoughts, but like, you know, I don't think it's too big of a deal to just say like, hey, how are you? Or I'm doing well. But also in the same breath, I also don't think it should be this like, oh my gosh, like, we need to strong arm these kids into being fake. Like, I don't think that's the answer either. So like I said earlier, every generation gets mocked. Every generation has their problem. Every generation has their whole thing that people like to joke about. So again, millennials have the millennial pause, and basically the millennial pause is the joke that, when a millennial would turn on the camera, they wouldn't start talking right away because they didn't know that they were recording. Like back when the digital age cameras really started to, obviously pop off, more video and content creation started to become a thing. That's the millennial pause. Boomers were once caricatured as having the lead paint stare, and this is implying that they're slow due to lead paint exposure. And I think this has become such a big conversation now because of social media. Because social media is able to take these conversations by storm, that's why it goes viral, and then there's a sweeping generalization made about so many different people. That's why this has become a thing. You know what I'm saying? Every generation has had their thing, but social media amplifies these conversations. I like to think that in another timeline, if TikTok were a thing in 1980, we probably would have seen stuff about the boomer lead paint stare. You would have had Gen Xers, constantly rolling their eyes on TikTok like, oh my God, oh my gosh. You probably would have seen that on TikTok. I mean, hey, am I wrong or am I right? Social media does a lot. So again, I think stepping away from the bigger memes, the jokes about the Gen Z stare, I think this is really bringing about more conversations just about emotional labor in the workplace, about workplace etiquette, as well as socialization or lack thereof due to external circumstances. So I think it begs the question, should politeness and cheeriness be a job requirement, or should we reconsider those expectations? It's making me wonder, that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier. It's okay, if this is not the standard anymore, if friendliness is not the standard, then what should the new standard be? And I also think it's a good conversation on how we perceive emotion, we will look at emotion differently. Age groups perceive different emotional or social cues differently. A blank stare is seen as rude or disrespectful to a boomer, but to a Gen Zer, it's literally just that, a blank stare. Why do we assign negativity to a neutral face? You know what I'm saying? Why are we immediately assigning negativity to it? Or why are we assuming that someone who's cheerful is automatically positive? It makes you question these different interpretations of, social cues. I also think that young people, especially with this whole chronically online generation we have, people are constantly online. We have this chronically online state where a lot of young people also curate nonchalance. I feel like nonchalance is seen as cool nowadays, which is so annoying. But that was also a thing back then too. But it's nonchalance is seen as cool. It's seen as cool to not be cringy. You have to kind of denote oh, I'm cool, I'm this, I don't feel this, I don't feel that, I don't feel my emotions. I feel like that's a thing. Oh, nonchalance is cool now. Honestly, wrapping up my thoughts, I really think that in general, empathy goes a long way. I think obviously elder generations could be more empathetic to younger generations and understanding that just because someone seems a bit off in their workplace, that doesn't mean that they're being rude. But I also think for Gen Z, it doesn't cost much to just be respectful. I don't think it costs much. I don't think it's crazy. I don't think it's whatever. I just think it's not that deep. So I just wanted to kind of throw out my thoughts on the whole conversation. I think it's a very interesting debate, and yeah, just let me know what y'all think in the comments, and I'll talk to y'all in the next one.